Hello and welcome to the latest installment of our educational webinar series, Growing Under Cover. We're pleased to have you join us today. My name is Joshua and I'm here to help facilitate this event. I'd like to briefly introduce today's presenter. Niki Jabbour is the best-selling award-winning author of 4 books, including The Year-Round Vegetable Gardener and Growing Under Cover. She's a 2-time winner of the American Horticultural Society's Book Award, the longtime host of the radio show The Weekend Gardener, and a valued partner at Johnny Selected Seeds. You can find Niki at savvygardening.com. Hi, Niki. Thank you for joining us today.
Joshua. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh, as am I, and I think we have a lot to cover. So I'm going to just get out of the way and turn things over to you so that we can get started.
All right, sounds good. Well, let me share my screen so I can bring up my presentation here. There we go. Okay, well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Niki Jabbour, and I'm coming at you from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is just north of where Joshua is and live in Maine, about 9 hours if you're driving north towards me. Like many of you, I'm sure, you garden in a short season climate. And I've been growing vegetables for over 30 years under very challenging conditions. And I've learned to adapt and use different techniques and structures and such to help me harvest year round. So I'm going to talk tonight about growing under cover, one of my favorite topics. So thank you again for joining us, and huge thanks to the awesome employee owners at Johnny Selected Seeds. I've been buying their seeds since I was, well, a teenager, and I've been growing them every year ever since. So I'm very pleased to be partnered with them for this fun talk tonight. And please, again, do leave your questions in the chat throughout. So what does growing under cover mean? Well, as you can see from this photo, this is my garden in late spring, and I've got, well, several different types of covers in my garden. In the foreground, you see some row cover, a very handy cover. In fact, I like to tell people, if they're just going to invest in one type of garden cover, I'd say row cover is probably the best one to start with. You also might notice there's some willow cloches there just in front of me. Behind, there's a pop-up cloche. There's also some shade cloth being used to protect some greens from bolting. And then, of course, I have my my favorite season extender of all, my polytunnel, which has just been such a game changer in my garden, having a protected environment like that to grow in. So, you know, basically, growing under cover just means growing plants under a controlled environment to basically encourage healthier growth and larger yield. So that, to me, is what growing under cover means. And in spring, summer, fall, and winter, I'm using a variety of garden covers. So here's a glimpse of my spring garden. Lots of covers being put to work in spring for a variety of reasons, which I will talk about. But here I've got mini hoop tunnels. I've got ones that I've DIY'd myself, including DIYing those metal hoops in the background there to make the mini hoop tunnels. And those are covering just planted tomato seedlings because, listen, I guarantee you the day I tuck my tomatoes into the unprotected garden is the day we get a frost. So me using these mini hoop tunnels just helps prevent frost damage to things like tomatoes. Also, mini hoop tunnel kits. You don't have to make your mini hoop tunnels if you don't want to. You can buy kits, and there's so many different types of products on the market. I've also got shade cloth, protecting some greens and slowing the potential of them bolting, going from vegetative growth to flowering, which of course changes the flavor of the greens. So I'm just trying to get a couple extra weeks out of those greens. There's also cloches over top some basil plants. So again, spring is a busy time in the garden, and I use lots of different types of season extenders. Now, summer is the season, and I mean, we're still in summer now, although I gotta say today is the first day it actually feels like autumn. And while I do love the cooler temperatures, I was planting arugula and spinach and chard in my garden just this afternoon. I do love summer and all the tomatoes. As you can see, I'm still enjoying and harvesting from my garden, as well as lots of other warm season crops. And as someone who's grown up in a challenging, short, season climate, particularly 25 years ago, it was more difficult for me to grow heat lovers, like the really large slicing tomatoes, like hot peppers, like melons, things like this, eggplant. But now, thanks to, I guess, the climate emergency, it's much easier to do. But having a protected structure like a polytunnel, like a greenhouse, like a geodesic dome, certainly helps gardeners in short seasons really expand the types of vegetables they can grow. So I do love my polytunnel. Autumn in the garden. So this isn't that glamorous a shot of the garden, but it lets you see what it really looks like in autumn. This is about a month after our first frost. And as you can see, there's still a few things blooming in the garden, a few late sunflowers, some marigolds, different things like that, some amaranth. But then I've got all these covers. The one in the foreground, that little mini hoop tunnel with the metal that I bent to create those the hoops. That's covering cabbages and broccoli. The one I'm lifting up is spinach and arugula and some winter lettuces. And then in behind, there's a variety of other types of winter crops. And if you can kind of like look with some eagle eyes towards the polytunnel, you'll see no longer are those tomatoes filling up the polytunnel. It's now switched to root crops like beets and carrots and turnips, as well as salad greens like kale, Swiss chard, arugula, lettuces like Nova lettuces, and spinach. So, as the seasons change, sort of the vegetables I harvest. But I'm always still using different types of garden covers to make sure that I grow the healthiest crops. Winter, well, this is my season, my favorite season in terms of the ease of the garden, because this is a time when I'm not fighting deer, groundhogs, slugs, flea beetles. It's a very low maintenance time in the garden. I'm not watering, I'm not weeding, I'm just harvesting, So to me, it's a very peaceful time in the garden. And it's also a bountiful time in the garden. I mean, I'm harvesting different types of kales and root crops and salad greens. So, and stem crops like leeks, of course. So there's quite a bounty even in winter time. So I am using garden covers year round in different ways. So why am I using garden covers? Because it's not just weather. There's lots of reasons to use garden covers and put these guys to work in your gardens. So weather protection is obvious, anything from frost, but hails and downpours. But I'm also doing it for pest protection. Unfortunately, garden covers don't really stop the slugs in my garden, but they do stop things like deer and groundhogs and rabbits and chipmunks and squirrels and the neighbors. But you can also use them as well to create microclimates around your crops, like I do with my polytunnel. But even if you're starting tomatoes in spring, when you put them in the garden, adding a mini hoop tunnel over top, or even a couple of cloches over top your plants creates that microclimate and protects them. If the temperatures dip at night, if all of a sudden we have a big downpour or you get a hailstorm or something, your crops are protected. So it's just garden insurance. I think of my covers as garden insurance. So those are some of the reasons I use garden covers. But let's just look a little bit closer, because weather protection, people always say, are you that crazy winter garden lady? And obviously, yes, I am. I love harvesting all winter long, but it's not just weather protection for winter. I mean, as a gardener, I think we often speak in frost. That's the language of gardening. Well, you plant, this many weeks before the spring frost, or you start vegetables, before the fall frost. So frost is definitely a part of our language as gardeners, but it's also the downpours that we get now. No longer do we get like a nice day or two of rain in the middle of summer to keep the garden a nice deep watering. Now it's 10 minutes of very heavy downpour that's going to knock many of your vegetables flat. And honestly, that water doesn't even sink into the soil, it just runs off. Or maybe it's hail in a thunderstorm in the middle of summer, or a tropical storm or hurricane, or it's the sun itself. If I'm trying to establish my winter carrots, well, I'm planting Napoli carrots usually the last week in July. And at that point, it's dry, the soil is very dry, the temperatures are really hot. It can be hard to establish summer planted seedlings for your fall and winter vegetables. So using garden covers to create shade, whether it's row cover or shade cloth, definitely helps me establish crops even in the middle of summer. So there's lots of different types of weather, and no matter the weather, a garden cover is there to help you. Pests, from small pests like flea beetles you can hardly see, you just see the damage, to larger pests like deer. And my friends in Newfoundland deal with moose. I know Alaskans also deal with moose. I'm glad I don't deal with moose. I won't complain too much about the deer, as well as the groundhogs, and rabbits and squirrels and chipmunks. There's a lot of pests out there that can, of course, enjoy your garden vegetables as much as you do. So there's different types of covers you can use for that. This is Protect Net, which is great for insect pests, but also protects from larger critters. Here's one I'm sure many of you recognize. This is a deer. I usually have them walking all around the garden on a daily basis. There's about a dozen deer that like to wander through my garden every day. And as you can see, those yellowy strings, that's my electric fence. And it does keep them out of the garden, which is helpful, of course. But it doesn't keep out the groundhogs or the rabbits. So I've had to add a chicken wire barrier around the whole garden as well. But you can also use garden covers. You could use mini hoop tunnels covered in chicken wire, or insect netting, or different things like that to help keep out some of these pests from your crops. So many different ways we can use these garden covers. And then again, as I mentioned, just to grow healthier plants. You don't want plunging temperatures or hard frosts, derailing your crops in spring. Damaged crops, they'll take a lot of energy to bounce back, and they might not then live up to the yield potential. So ensuring your crops are well protected, have that perfect little microclimate to put on fast growth, really helps them go from seed to harvest quickly, and with fewer pests as well. Because when plants struggle, they tend to attract more pests. So I definitely try to keep my plants as healthy and productive as possible. And using garden covers is a very easy way to do that. I mean, look at these Posano tomatoes. I mean, using a cover like this, my polytunnel really sets me off early and quickly, and produces strong, vigorous growth for many of these heat lovers. So let's talk a bit about the types of garden covers. I know I've hinted at some of them, but I'd like to delve into that a little bit more. And then in section 2, towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about just some of the tasks to keep in mind when you're using garden covers, because they do differ a little bit, of course, from gardening in an open, unprotected garden. So, but let's start off with talking about the types of covers. So this photo here is a really simple level of protection. This is an autumn photo, about a month after the first fall frost that we had. And this is just simply wires covered in a clear plastic sheet of greenhouse plastic. And you can see I've even got little binder clips for holding that on. This wasn't meant to go into winter. This is not very strong in terms of what it's going to do in the garden. It's not a durable tunnel, but of course, you know, if I'm going into winter with mini hoop tunnels, I make them more durable. But this just shows you that even like 4 weeks after the frost, you can still have your garden going strong with a very inexpensive, simple DIY. So arugula and spinach here. I mean, my gosh, look, even the sweet alyssum is still flowering. And in the background, you can see the little bits of lettuce that are coming up there as well. But some of the garden covers I'm going to talk about include mulch, mini hoop tunnels, cold frames, and then the larger walk-in structures like the greenhouses, the polytunnels, and the geodesic domes. I mean, we all know there's been a garden boom the past couple of years, but there's also been a greenhouse boom. So many gardeners have taken time now where they're growing more food, they're using their gardens more, their home more, to put in those structures so they can help increase their food security and even increase their production. So I'll talk a bit about polytunnels and domes and greenhouses as well. But let's start with the most basic. Let's start with mulch. I mean, mulch is one of the first ways I learned how to protect my vegetables. And you know, mulch is as simple as a layer of straw or shredded leaves, or if you're close to the ocean like I am, you can even use seaweed. Washed up eelgrass or seaweed also works well. And all of those, of course, enrich your soil as they break down too. But here's an example of pulling carrots in the middle of winter. I remember I showed, this is a photo from Growing Under Cover, my latest book, and I showed it to one of my non-gardening friends, and they flipped through the book and they looked at this photo and they said, you know, the leaves don't look all that healthy though. I mean, they're kind of yellowy. And I'm like, well, it was February. I mean, how they've been under a pile of mulch since, you know, December. 2 months under mulch still yields beautiful, super sweet, aromatic, you know, crisp as anything carrots. I'm going to call that a win. You know, during the summer, we might eat our carrot greens using them in pestos and such. But in the winter, they start to yellow a little bit, but the roots are perfect. And these will be the best tasting carrots you have all year from your garden. So this is just using simple mulch. You can see I've got a row cover on top of the mulch as well, and that serves a function. So it basically holds the mulch in place. We get a lot of wind, a lot of storms in the winter here. So I want to make sure that mulch doesn't blow away. So I have the carrots. On top goes the mulch, and then goes an old piece of a row cover or something else that I might have on hand. I usually use old row covers that are already maybe ripped and not good enough for mini hoop tunnels anymore. It's a good second life for them. When I'm using plastic products, I want to use them as much as I can before I recycle them. So again, mulch is very simple. I usually try to add about 12 to 18 inches of mulch to my raised beds for the root crops. And then again, the row cover or something goes on top to hold it in place. So this is a carrot bed that I was just in the middle of mulching. But again, you can use shredded leaves as well if you have a source of shredded leaves, or something like seaweed too. So there's lots of vegetables you can deep mulch. Carrots, of course, are probably the most popular. And if you have carrots in your garden in autumn, you know, you don't have to harvest them all before winter arrives. You can deep mulch them, even if you didn't plant and plan ahead for winter harvesting. If you still have carrots or parsnips in your garden, you can definitely put this technique to work in your garden this fall. So carrots, my favorite varieties like Napoli and Mokum, parsnips like Javelin, celery root, Brilliant is a wonderful variety. And celery root is so great. I mean, celery, if you buy it from the supermarket, it's one of those crops that's very high in pesticides. And organic celery here costs about $9 for one celery heart, so it's very expensive. So celery, I have about 6 or 7 months of the year, and the rest of the year I have celery root, and it just does double duty in the garden. It's such a great vegetable. Beets, things like red A's or touchstone gold. Beets are so delicious because, like carrots or kale or other vegetables, they just taste better in the winter as the starches turn to sugar. So it's another great one to winter harvest, as well as leeks as a stem crop. About a foot and a half of mulch around them, well, you know, allows me to harvest them all winter long. And daikon radishes. Now, These do not go as long. They're not as winter hardy as carrots or beets or celery root, but I still get about 6 to 8 weeks of an extended season harvesting them when I mulch them. So to me, that's worth it. They won't go into January, late January, February, but they usually go up to about the new year. And, that's a win in my book. So also daikon radishes like watermelon, also known as red meat. So lots of options there. Mini hoop tunnels. So mini hoop tunnels are a super easy DIY. And this is a great time to think about them. This is the time I'm, cleaning up some of the crops that are now spent in the garden. And I'm also opening the garden shed. I'm, opening up some of my mini hoop tunnel covers. I'm looking at them, checking them for tears or rips. I'm washing off plastic covers if they were a little dusty, maybe when I stored them this past spring. So, I'm cleaning anything that needs to be cleaned. Maybe I'm buying more wire to make more hoops, or I'm going to use my hoop bender to make more metal hoops for my garden. This is a good prepping time. I mean, obviously, September or early October, not as busy in the garden as it was back in May, June, when spring is such a rush. So this is a great time to consider the kind of season extenders you want and maybe make some new ones. So mini hoop tunnels just have two components. They have hoops and they have clear covers or other types of covers. But this mini hoop tunnel here, as you see, has a clear cover and very simple. This was a very temporary fall protection in the garden. It took like a minute and a half to make, but there's lots of materials you can use for the hoops as well as the cover. So let's look at some cover materials first. Rope covers, again, the most basic of all the garden covers, I think. And they're so fantastic. These are essential in my garden. And while there are different types, different weights, you don't need them all in a home garden. You probably pick just lightweight, and that will do many different types of jobs for you in the garden. And row covers protect from light frosts, from inclement weather, as well as from pests, whether it's insect pests like flea beetles or cucumber beetles or squash bugs, or bigger pests like deer and groundhogs and rabbits and even birds over top just seeded beds. There's been times I've planted lettuce or something in the garden, come inside the house, kind of look out the window at the garden, thinking how great it is. I just got that job done. And then you'll see birds all over the bed picking up the seeds you just planted. So putting a row cover down, whether it's directly on top of the soil or floated on hoops for a couple days until those seeds get a chance to settle in, is a great way to prevent the birds from eating all of your hard-earned planted seeds. And again, as I mentioned, you can lay them on top of the crops directly or float them on hoops. Generally, I'm floating them hoops unless it's something really short term, like seed protection. Just because, particularly in winter, if you have, say, a row cover laying on top of arugula and you get a hard frost, I can assure you that cover is going to freeze to the arugula leaves. And when you try to lift it off, you're going to damage that crop. So you definitely don't want to do that. You want to be very careful. In that case, that's why I'm floating them on top over hoops. So the different types of row covers: lightweight, medium weight, heavyweight. Then there's ultra lightweight ones that are used as insect barriers for pest protection. But lightweight ones, as you can kind of see here, for example, Agribon 15 or 19. I mean, it offers frost protection to 28 degrees Fahrenheit or -2 degrees Celsius. And that would be the all-purpose one I would recommend buying. It lets about 85% of the light through. So even if you're leaving it in place a few weeks in the spring or fall garden, it's going to let enough light through that you're still going to have healthy plant growth. Now, medium weight row covers let about 70% of light through, and they protect just to a little bit colder, to about 26 degrees Fahrenheit or -3 degrees Celsius for all the Canadians out there, like myself. So this is great short-term protection. If I was going to, get a frost over my tomatoes in spring, I would put this over top, knowing that it's going to protect, that night. But I wouldn't leave it on for a week or two over top newly planted seeds or seedlings, because again, it just blocks too much light. And then you've got heavyweight row cover, Agribon 50 or 70, which blocks, well, 50% of the light or 70% of the light. So it's nothing, again, you'd use long term, but it's fine to use in winter time if you've got tunnels where a lot of plants aren't putting on a lot of active growth over winter. It does provide a heavier duty of protection for them for different types of winter crops you might be harvesting. And they protect to about 24 Fahrenheit or -4 degrees Celsius. An example of some row cover I spotted at a restaurant I was visiting in North Carolina a couple years ago. And as you can see, I asked the chef, I'm like, why do you have these little tunnels set up over top your crops? Beautiful kitchen garden at this restaurant. And he was like, to stop the pests from getting in. And, there is obviously one glaring problem there. If you're looking at this photo, you might see, well, there's a gaping hole in one of the tunnels. That's going to let the pests in. But generally speaking, if your covers are in good shape without big holes, you can easily expect them to keep the pests out. And they have them twisted at the end, so little caterpillar tunnels with just wire hoops. Simple, easy, inexpensive way to protect your crops. Just make sure they don't have any large gaping holes. Here's an example of me just laying a cover right over top a bed, just for, again, a very simple layer of protection. I wouldn't leave this on for a hard freeze. Again, it could freeze to your crops. You don't want that. But if you maybe have just planted things and you didn't want the hot, dry weather, potentially to stress out your plants or cause shock, you could drape it over top like this. Or if you're preventing birds from digging up seeds, again, this works very well. An easy way to protect crops until those seeds germinate. You do have to remember, if you're using row covers or insect netting, to protect from cucumber beetles or squash bugs or things like that. For crops that need to be pollinated to produce their crop, cucumbers, melons, squash, for example, make sure to remove those covers when the plants begin to flower. Otherwise, pollination is not going to happen unless you do it yourself, and you will end up with, well, beautiful, healthy plants undamaged by insects and pests, but sadly, no fruit. So do make sure you remove the covers when they start to flower. But if you're using row covers to protect against something like potato beetles and you have them over top your potato plants, well, potatoes don't need to be pollinated to produce their tubers, so you can leave them in place all season long. It's a good idea to float them over top so there's lots of room and maximum sunlight can reach the plants. If you have them just draped on top of the plants without hoops, oftentimes they kind of bunch or wrinkle up and they can block more light. So just make sure to float them on top on hoops. Shade cloth. This is another material I like to use on my mini hoop tunnels, as you can see here. This is actually inside my polytunnel, so I do double up my covers sometimes, but I use these little hoops and shade cloth in my garden as well. So shade cloth is great in spring to basically go over top salad greens like lettuces. Here on the left are Salanova lettuces. There's spinach, there's mixed greens and lettuces, and it helps delay bolting. When the weather, the days are getting longer, the weather's getting hotter, a lot of salad greens are going to switch from vegetative growth to bolting, to flowering, and then seed producing. So this can help delay that by a couple weeks. So it's definitely a useful material to keep on hand. It's also super durable. Like the shade cloth that I've been using in my garden, I've been using for about 15 years. It's never torn. I don't have to replace it. It's just a very durable material. You can also use it for summer planting of seeds as well, which I'll talk about. But there are different types of shade cloth. I mean, if you're looking for different types, 30% is common and 50%. I prefer 30 to 40% for most of my garden use. That blocks, well, 30 to 40% of the light. As you can see from this photo, you still can kind of see through it, but it does block some of the light, so it can slow bolting for sure. If you're using something really high, like 50 or 70% shade cloth, that blocks so much light that if you're still trying to encourage some growth underneath it, it might slow that growth a little too much. But as you can see, I just have it simply floated on hoops over top this bed. Sun protection for summer planted seeds. This is something I do all the time in July and August, and even early September sometime if the weather is still really hot, just to protect newly seeded things, whether it's daikon radishes, whether it's carrots, whether it's scallions, anything like that I'm planting in summer, or even things like lettuces if I'm trying to plant them in late August. Just to make sure they have time to grow before the days get too short and the weather gets too cold. You can use these to create some shade. It also helps the soil hold more moisture, so germination can take place really quickly and easily. And certain seeds like lettuce don't want to germinate when the temperature is too high anyway, so you want to try to keep it as cool as you can down there. And using covers like shade cloth can reduce the ambient temperature underneath the tunnel. So it's a very easy way to help establish crops when the weather is hot and dry. And I tell you, my garden hasn't seen a deep rain since June. So the soil is very dry. I've been trying, of course, to mulch in deep water occasionally, but I've definitely been trying to conserve water as well. So putting covers like this to use definitely helps me conserve water and just be more tactical and strategic in my garden. So shade cloth also can be used in spring or summer when you're hardening off seedlings that you've grown indoors under grow lights. I'm pointing to my grow lights. You probably can't see them, but it's a great way to harden off those seedlings. Of course, you can try to find a shady spot around your home, but doing so by creating just a mini hoop tunnel covered in shade cloth is just an instant way to create that shade for hardening off your seedlings. So this is something I do all the time, and it just makes it very easy to take that week or so to make sure your seedlings are then acclimatized to outdoor growing conditions. Polyethylene sheeting, another popular cover for mini hoop tunnels. And I've got a couple different examples to show you. I am trying to use less plastic in my garden for sure, like I'm sure many of you. So when I invest in a plastic product, I want to make sure it's going to last a very long time before I recycle it. So in this photo, for example, you see plastic drop cloth, which is super inexpensive, but it's also really, really thin and it's not UV treated, so it degrades very quickly in the garden. Usually only lasts one season for me. I don't mean a whole year, I mean one season. So if you're using it in spring or summer or fall, it's only going to last maybe 3 months and then it starts to break down and tear. And I don't want that in my garden. I don't want something that doesn't last very well in my garden. I'd rather invest in something like 6 mil greenhouse poly that is going to last for anywhere from 4 to 6 years in my garden on many hoop tunnels with gentle use. So that is what I prefer to use. And then I can recycle it when it's done. So if you're going to use plastic, try to get something that's going to be durable and long lasting. And in the end, of course, it's going to be cheaper for you when you consider the square foot price because it's going to last so much longer. These are great for spring and fall covers. I don't use plastic covers in the summer, but I'm also using them, of course, in winter as well. And they're just a great way to capture solar energy. They let about 90 to 95% of light pass through, depending on the material you're using. So you're getting a lot of sunlight. So in spring, as you can see here, mini hoop tunnels, quick and easy to build. You can use them in-ground gardens. You can use them in raised beds like I do. You can use them in so many different types of ways. But again, this is right over top some tomatoes just planted, just to ensure that they settle in nicely. And I don't have to worry about the temperature dipping or a light frost damaging those plants. So again, mini hoop tunnels in spring and fall, just an excellent garden insurance. And I use them all the time. As you can see in wintertime, these are some Salanova lettuces in my winter garden. So this is in January. It looks very pretty out there, but unfortunately, it's a very quiet time in the garden. But I'm still harvesting things like, if you look at the very back, you can see some arugula as well, but these were different types of Salanova lettuces. And this mini hoop tunnel, actually, I didn't really intend it to go all winter long. It was sort of one of those late autumn ones I threw together thinking I'd leave it on for a couple weeks. So I didn't really secure it with even a center support like I normally would. But you know what? It just kept going and going, the lettuces. So I'm like, all right, I'm just going to leave it. And again, it went until about late January until we finished off all these lettuces. And again, this is this past January in my garden. As you can see, there's a storm. Hear the wind. And this is lifting a cover and seeing again some of those Salanova lettuces, as well as a little bit of arugula. Those were not the same year. The first one with the winter lettuces was 2020, and this was just this past January, 2022. So, but again, I've been growing these for years. I love the Salanova ones because they're cold hardy and heat tolerant. So there's really not a time of the year I can't grow them here. And they're just so packed with leaves. Each head is in such an incredibly dense rosette. So delicious. So how do I keep covers on? This is a question I'm asked a lot. And I will admit I did struggle with this very early on. And for a long time, there were row cover ghosts just around my garden as they had blown off in storms. And it's like, well, how can I prevent this? And I've used many materials over the years and different ways to keep covers on. I mean, weights work great. Sandbags, rocks, logs, anything that's not sharp that's going to poke a hole in a row cover or a sheet of plastic is fine. But honestly, snap clamps are what I generally use. I'll put a couple in spring and fall. I'll just use one per hoop. But if we're going to have a storm or a lot of wind, I'll put 2 or 3 per hoop. Often I'll still weigh the ends of the tunnels down as well to make sure they don't flap, especially in winter time. And we, again, have a lot of strong winds and storms, nor'easters. It's just a great way to make sure my covers stay in place. So hoop materials, what can you use for your hoops to support all those covers we just talked about? Well, this is a 4-foot diameter hoop made with my Johnny's low tunnel hoop bender, which I've, probably had for close to a decade. And metal hoops just are a game changer in terms of strength and durability. They just create these mini tunnels that are, I don't have to worry about them collapsing. I do use 1/2-inch PVC conduit. I've had lengths of 10-foot 1/2-inch PVC conduit in my garden for over 20 years, and I'm still using them because it is a resilient, durable material. But they're not as strong as metal, hoops. And if, for example, if I have 3 hoops in one of my raised beds, and most of my beds are either 4x8 or 4x10 feet, and I just have the 3 plastic PVC hoops, and we get a strong snow, a heavy snow, they will pancake down. That does not happen with the metal hoops. So for my PVC hoops, I do have to add a center support down the middle of the structure just to make sure they stay, upright all winter long. I don't have to do that with the metal ones because they're so much stronger. So I do love that. But you can also use 9-gauge wire, which I know I've kind of shown you here and there as well. Very inexpensive material. You can cut it to length depending on the width of your beds or how high or low you want them to be. In my polytunnel, the beds are 3 feet wide, so I do cut them a little shorter than I would need to for my 4-foot wide beds. But you can also use sheets of wire mesh. And I'll show you those as well. And I use sheets of wire mesh to make my bean tunnels. I use them for trellising. I use them in so many ways in the garden. They're just so incredibly useful. And that is also a really strong material, but you can make great mini hoop tunnels with them as well. So 9-gauge wire hoops. This is an example of one of those late December snows that I didn't necessarily expect. And this is just a little one of those fall mini hoops. This is tunnels. I wouldn't expect this to go all winter long, but we had this unexpected snow, and I go up to the garden and find the mini hoop tunnel, lift up the cover, and you see the arugula still looks amazing. And this snow melted within a day, and then I still got another month out of that little mini hoop tunnel before winter really settled in. But again, 9-gauge wire hoops are quick, easy, inexpensive, great for spring, fall, summer for hardening off with shade cloth or row covers or helping establish those summer seedlings. Or you can even use them for doubling up, like inside a polytunnel or greenhouse. So these are those 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of cattle panel or wire mesh. Sometimes they're called concrete reinforcement mesh. So they go by different names. Here they cost about $15 to $20 each at the hardware stores or home improvement stores. I can never find the long sheets of cattle panel here, the ones that are 16 feet long that make such beautiful, perfect tunnels in gardens. So I only use the 4 by 8 foot sheets, and they do a fine job. They do eventually, obviously, rust. They look rusty, but I don't mind that. I think it adds a little bit of extra interest to the garden, and it doesn't hurt the plants at all. But you can bend them over top raised beds. You could, use stakes and establish them in an in-ground garden, and they make a very strong cover. And because, of course, they're mesh, not single hoops, they don't collapse under snow load, so they're very strong. And I know people also use them to keep deer and other pests out of the garden, as well as pets, neighbors' pets, people's own dogs and cats out of the garden. So they're also really useful for that as well. You can also buy kits for mini hoop tunnels. You don't have to DIY them at all if you don't want to. But this kit, for example, I think it was $99, so $100 for this mini hoop tunnel kit. Now, to be fair, it came with 2 covers. This plastic cover, which had windows on the side, and I could zip it up and unzip it in different ways to let air flow through and to harvest. So it was great and useful. But that cover blew off every single time it got windy, so I had to eventually zip tie it to the structure. And the structure eventually really rusted too. And so it lasted about 4 years, maybe 3.5 years for $100. But that money may be better spent on materials and DIYing your own. But it also did come with a shade cloth cover as well, which I didn't use nearly as much as I did the plastic cover. But it's handy for winter harvesting. It has that nice angle to the roof, so it did shed snow very well. Again, it just wasn't a great structure in terms of how long it's going to last. And if I'm introducing materials to my garden, I'm trying to waste less and use less. So I want to make sure it's something that I can get a lot of use out of. Cold frames. All right, that's mini hoop tunnels. Let's put a pin in that and move on now. We've talked about hoops and materials, but now it's time to look at cold frames. So cold frames, well, I think of them as year-round food factories. They're just bottomless boxes with clear tops. Sometimes they have clear sides, like this cedar veg trug one here. But you, of course, can make them. You can buy kits for cold frames. Most of them should be faced towards the south. They have angled tops as well to capture maximum solar energy. And these are my winter carrots in the garden. So these were planted the last week in July. Sometimes if I'm a little negligent, it's first week in August. And then we start harvesting them, usually in October, and then, well, until we run out, usually sometime in March. If there's any left in the garden by March, as soon as the ground starts to thaw, I'm going to dig them out quickly before those plants start to grow. But cold frames are fantastic. They're a great protective cover for so many different types of vegetables. So here's another kind of kit you can buy, polycarbonate. Obviously, a polycarbonate sided cold frame is not as insulating for winter as one that's wood. So most of the cold frames I build are made from local hemlock, which is a very rot resistant wood here. Some people like cedar. Cedar is amazing, but it's very expensive. So hemlock is quite inexpensive, and it's just as rot resistant as cedar. So I do use hemlock, but polycarbonate kits are fine. The only problem with them is they're not as insulating, but you can get around that by hilling up fall leaves or straw, or gosh, even just the soil around the outside of them in late autumn. And that, obviously you'll block light from the sides, but that's okay. The plants aren't actively growing, most types of plants in winter anyway. So it'll still create a nice microclimate for them. And the top, of course, will still let in light as well. So here's an example of me mulching around the exact same cold frame I just showed you. And you can see if you look inside the cold frame there, so there was mizunas, there was some mosh in there, some beets for greens and baby roots. There was 2 types of winter lettuces, North Pole and winter density, I believe. So again, just a very easy way to extend your harvest and enjoy homegrown food. Wood sided cold frame. So the one on the left is by Emma Biggs, a 16-year-old garden expert, tomato heirloom, like an heirloom tomato expert from Toronto. And I've got her Instagram down there. She's amazing, as well as one of my cold frames in February. I mean, when we shot the year-round vegetable gardener, my editor came up from Massachusetts, and it was we'd had so much snow. It was such a brutal winter, and she's like, I wasn't allowed to open the cold frames because they wanted to get that shot of me opening the cold frames in the virgin snow. So I hadn't opened them in about 10 days. And she's like, everything is going to be dead. They were so worried. And I was like, it's fine. So I walked up to get the shot and I lifted the cover of the cold frames and she just gasped because it was like spring in there. It was green, all these different shades of green. It smelled like spring. The soil wasn't frozen. That's a cold frame. It's just amazing how it creates that microclimate around the plants. And in here, I've got things like lettuce and tatsoi and endive and escarole. So there's a lot of different vegetables you can grow in a cold frame, even in cold climates for winter harvesting. This is me 2 weeks ago. Just built a new cold frame using an old window that I was given by somebody, and just my extra little scraps of clear poly. Another way to use up those extra little pieces of plastic you have. And now I've got this lovely hemlock cold frame to go in the garden. It's already been sited in the garden, and I planted up some calibration mixed kale in my garden, as well as some Salanova lettuces. So that is now in the cold frame, and I'm looking forward to harvesting those in the coming months. So a fun DIY project. There's loads of plans online, of course. There's one in the back of Growing Under Cover and Year-Round Vegetable Gardener too. But if you're going to DIY one from an old frame, an old window frame, it's super, super easy to do. So let's touch on larger garden structures, greenhouses, polytunnels, geodesic domes. So my polytunnel here, I mean, it's 14 by 24 feet. I've had it for about, I guess, almost 5 years now. And I mean, it's just my favorite place to be any time of the year, even when it's like super hot outside. I love being in there with the tomatoes and all the eggplants and Lebanese melons I'm growing. It's so much fun, and it's such a productive space. And I really like my garden. I try to use every square inch I can of vertical space, and of course of the growing space. I just want to cram it with food. So this is it in very early spring, late winter. This is like when the snow is melting. I've just cleaned out a bunch of the winter crops. We've finished the turnips. We've finished, the leeks and scallions in there. We finished the lettuces, and I'm just prepping again for late winter, early spring planting. Oftentimes you can see there's tulips in there. I will plant a whole row of daffodils or tulips or grape hyacinths for extra early cutting. They usually bloom by late February. So, I mean, this is such a great space. And of course you can grow containers in there. During the main growing season right now, for example, if I walk up to my polytunnel, the whole center is well, like fabric planters with my tomatoes. So you look at this space and you see all of that empty space in the air. Well, my goal is to fill all of it from the ground space to the vertical space. And this is how I do it. So as you can see, early August, mid-August, it's just a jungle in there. These are sun gold tomatoes. Look at them, they're gorgeous. They're out of control. Even 2 sun gold tomatoes fill it. And there's also, you can't see them because they're hidden by the tomatoes, but there's also different types of cucumbers and melons in there. Along the side, there's peppers and eggplants, sometimes squash, beans. Right now, of course, I've been starting to pull out some of the heat lovers that are pretty much done. Those first round of summer cucumbers. And now I've established carrots and beets in there and scallions for winter. And again, more turnips and baby kale and lots of different vegetables. So this is really a productive way to really increase your food productivity in a home garden. In the wintertime, you see it here. I am doubling up my covers. There's row cover on top of those with just wire hoops. I'm harvesting turnips. And again, all the vegetables I just mentioned. I do clean up the tomato fabric bags in the middle of winter, so it's cleaner and easier to get around. And I store them so that I can start fresh again in the spring. But again, such a great way to really increase your winter gardening. And when we built this, I was thinking to myself, am I going to spend a lot of time in here? And do I want to have a potting area? Do I want to have a sitting area? How do I want to use this space? And I honestly didn't know because, until you use a space, you don't know how you're going to use the space, but I did want to include a sitting area. So this is where I do a lot of my writing. The Wi-Fi reaches up here. I also do a lot of tea drinking here and reading. So it's quite an enjoyable place. It's not a big area. It's only 5 by 7, but it's the perfect place to sit and relax and enjoy the garden. And when those tomatoes are super tall, no one knows where I am, so I can hide from everybody. So it's pretty fantastic. So greenhouses, this is a DIY greenhouse about 10 minutes from my home. They made it with old windows and then they bought some Lexan polycarbonate for the roof. And it's a beautiful structure. It's super useful. They grow in buckets in it, so they don't actually grow in the ground in it. They had all these buckets and they hung up some vertical trusses as well, or horizontal trusses up top so they can grow vertically, as you can see here. So here the same greenhouse is. So from here to here in just a couple months. Eggplants, I mean, there's peppers, there's tomatoes, lots of herbs in there as well, and other heat lovers. So this is a great way to sort of supplement with a protective space. And yeah, again, you don't have to buy an expensive type of greenhouse. I, of course, like many people, dream of that beautiful Gothic British type greenhouse, a glass greenhouse. But when I compare the cost of my walk-in polytunnel, 14 by 24 feet, to a similar sized glass greenhouse, you know, it went from $2,000 to $200,000. So it was pretty easy to stick to my polytunnel, and I'm very happy with that structure. Geodesic dome. So this is one about 5 minutes from my house. It's a 26-foot wide geodesic dome owned by Andrea and Cam, and it is just a wonder. It's triple wall polycarbonate. Even in winter, it's 20 degrees Celsius in there, which is probably 70, 75 degrees Fahrenheit, I guess. So it doesn't freeze. There's a big water reservoir in there as well, which helps, of course, act as a heat sink. They grow tomatoes in there and other crops all year round. It's a beautiful structure. Really fun. I would love to have a geodesic dome like this. They have it mounted on a knee wall as well to lift it even higher. So the inside height, I think, is close to 15 feet. So they get tomatoes that go pretty darn tall inside the structure. When you're choosing a large garden cover, things to think about. How much ideal space do you have? That's important because you're going to need a full sunny spot. You can't put this under trees or beside a building that's very shaded. It's going to need a lot of light. So you're going to want to site it in an area with full sun. So that, of course, is essential. And you also want to avoid trees, not just for their shading, but also because you don't want a branch to break or a tree to fall on your structure. So try to find an area where that is not going to happen. A level site is also very nice. It just makes it so much easier to build it. I mean, I'm semi-handy. You know, I can build a cold frame. I can DIY all my mini hoop tunnels, but this was a challenge to build this kit, I have to say, and maybe that's because the instructions weren't so great. We got it done, okay, but it did take longer than I thought it would. You know, so you might have to hire someone to help you put together a structure depending on what type of structure you want, of course. And, and think about size. When I first walked in this after we finished it, I thought 14 by 24 feet. How on earth am I going to fill it? Took me a week. Okay, so if you have it in your budget, go a little bigger because you will fill that space. If you're looking at like a tiny backyard greenhouse, like an 8 by 10 or an 8 by 16, get the bigger one if it's in your budget because you will not be sorry. Also, siting a greenhouse or polytunnel or other large structure near a water source is a good idea, of course. You might want to hook up some sort of irrigation system in there to make it really easy to water your plants. But either way, you're going to have to water in there because obviously Mother Nature cannot if you have a structure like this. So do think about that too. And electrical as well. You might need to hook up fans depending on the structure, the size and the type. So having access to electrical is also obviously really useful. So I'm just going to touch briefly on caring for undercover crops because obviously there are sometimes different things to think about than when you're gardening in an open garden that's open to the rain and the weather, of course. So I'll touch briefly on things like planting and watering and soil care and monitoring and things like that. Just to help you grow the healthiest vegetables you possibly can. So let's think about planting. So when you're planting in protective structures, garden covers like this cold frame, you often can plant anywhere from weeks to months earlier. It really extends your season, pushing spring back into winter, but also, pushing fall well into winter. So you really get a much longer growing season, but also your planting season is extended. So, I'll be planting in late February in my cold frames. As soon as they're empty and the days are starting to get longer again, I am out there seeding cold hardy crops, of course, but you definitely can start seeding early. Same thing applies for mini hoop tunnels. Once the crops are finished, if we have a nice mild day in February, I'll lift the cover, amend the soil, and replant again, and then put the cover back down. And in the polytunnel, I'm constantly seeding as well. So again, your planting season will change in that you'll be able to grow cold hardier plants for a longer period of time. You can also use garden covers to pre-warm the soil in spring. You could set up a mini hoop tunnel or even just lay black plastic or clear plastic tightly over top of bed to pre-warm soil for things like tomatoes, crops that don't like being planted directly into cold soil, which can set them back. Bean seeds, which can rot in cold, wet soil, or watermelons, eggplants, anything, any of the heat lovers that love to be planted in warmer soil. Pre-warm the soil for 7 to 10 days before you plant. Use your garden covers for that. It really does help give them a good start. So that's really important. So there's lots of ways to use different types of garden covers, even when you're planting. Soil care, I'm not really going to talk about this too much because this is a whole topic unto itself. Of course, healthy soil yields healthy plants, which yield the biggest crop and healthiest crop generally. That's the way it works, unless Mother Nature interferes with you. So do try to feed your soil. To me, soil care is everything. As I was cleaning out beds yesterday, I then topped the soil, which again has been so dry, with a bunch of leaf mold compost from my leaf compost bin. And then on top of that, I put some manure, about 1 inch of manure. And I'm hoping we'll get a rain to work that down sometime soon. But feeding your soil, feeding the worms, feeding the fungi, feeding the bacteria, feeding all those microorganisms in your soil is essential. I also don't deep dig or honestly dig my beds at all anymore. I'm generally no dig unless there's a reason I need to dig for something. A particularly long taproot that's not coming out or some tenacious weed I need to get out. But generally, I don't dig my beds anymore. And I do supplement with organic fertilizers where necessary. I do like to make my own compost, including using lots of seaweed from the ocean, which is so high in micronutrients and plant hormones. It's fantastic. But a soil test every 2 years lets me know as well where my soil is. And I do use lime. I lime my garden beds every year because our soils here in Nova Scotia are acidic. And most vegetables grow best with a soil pH of 6 to 7. Watering, I like to hand water, and I know that makes me a little strange, but I do like to hand water. I don't water the garden too much unless I'm spot watering something beneath a garden cover or just planted seeds or seedlings. Other than that, I rely on deep mulching, healthy soil with lots of organic matter to hold that moisture, and Mother Nature to water because I'm trying to be, conserve water. But in the polytunnel, of course, or a cold frame, you do have to provide the water. And I find hand watering, it allows me to keep track of my plants really well. I get to check in on them every couple of days. If it's in the polytunnel in the summer, for example, are the leaves turning brown? Do I see any pests? Are those tomatoes ready to harvest? Oh my gosh, those ones going to split if I don't pick them right now. Looking at the cucumbers and the melons. So to me, it's like checking in with my garden, and it's a pleasure to me. It's part of the process of gardening that I enjoy. I do try to water deeply when I water. I don't light sprinkle things because I want to encourage deep root systems. And I use, of course, as you can see here, even in my polytunnel, mulches to hold the soil moisture, straw mulches, shredded leaves, things like that. I deep mulch most of my vegetables to hold that soil moisture. You can, of course, run soaker hoses, irrigation systems, drip systems to reduce the work. I do have a soaker hose that I have hooked up at times, and it comes in very handy. So just there's lots of options out there for irrigation, though. And of course, if you've got a structure like again, a polytunnel or cold frame or mini hoop tunnel, water is not going to reach them, so you have to provide it. And remember, in spring or fall, if you've got them closed up, it's going to get hot in there very quickly, and the soil dries out quicker. So you will have to water more often if you're not venting very well. So that kind of brings me into the fact that venting is really important, and it's a skill that you really need to learn when you're using things like cold frames or polytunnels or mini hoop tunnels. It reduces humidity in structures. It just encourages good airflow and helps your plants harden off well. I always like to err on the side of venting. So if it's going to be above freezing, maybe it's going to be about 40 degrees, I will open my structures to allow some air to flow through. I don't want to grow my plants too warm. If you're coddling your seedlings in cold frames or your polytunnel and they're putting on lots of fresh green growth because you're keeping it quite warm, that is susceptible to damage when the temperatures do get seriously cold. So I like to grow things a bit on the colder side to basically create hardier growth. So venting is very important. Staking and supporting, using up, in a polytunnel, for example, or a greenhouse or a geodesic dome, use up all of your space, all of that vertical space by growing things vertically, cucumbers, melons, tomatoes, like indeterminate tomatoes. You really can maximize your harvest, but you'll also have fewer problems with insects and diseases because the airflow is better. And of course, if you are going to grow things vertically like tomatoes, you're probably going to want to, pinch them and prune them and train them properly. I do grow a lot of my things on twine, and I use strong twine. I actually double up the twine because the first year I used inexpensive twine. And, when that point when your tomatoes are huge, the plants, and laden with fruits, and then the twine snaps and the plant goes down, that's a little heartbreaking. So double up the twine or use proper, good quality twine like you'd find at Johnny's. Pinching and pruning, again, another important task if you're growing it vertically, or even, just in your polytunnels, your cold frames. I'm always on the lookout for blemished, damaged leaves, early signs of disease. It's great if you can learn to identify insects and different signs of diseases so you can stay on top of problems. You want to prune out diseased leaves if they're affected to slow any diseases that might go up the plant. You want to pinch tomato suckers and learn how to do it properly if you're pruning plants so that you can encourage good airflow, but also a vigorous plant and a large harvest. And again, I'm always monitoring for the signs of things like powdery mildew, especially if the weather has been very favorable to growing conditions. Keep an eye out for problems like this, because if you can nip them in the bud early, you might be able to slow the spread, or perhaps even eliminate it from your garden. So staying on top, and that's one of the reasons I like to hand water, because it lets me check in on my plants a couple times a week to make sure things are doing well. And I think that would be my last one. In terms of sharing some tips and advice. I know we will go to questions in a moment, but hopefully you've gotten some ideas and maybe you're ready to learn to grow under cover. And here, let me stop sharing my screen so we can get Liv to jump back on. She has been kindly gathering all the questions throughout today so that we can chat about them now. And Liv, thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, we had a ton of questions. We definitely won't be able to get to them all, but we will get through many of them. I think maybe the first question I'll ask is, we had several folks wondering about how to secure the conduit or the PVC for your low tunnels, either to your raised beds or in the ground, in a way that they won't sag and flop and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know I talk about that in my books. I've got like photos that demonstrate how I do that exactly. But the short version of it is, if you're doing an in-ground garden, like not raised beds, I use 1-foot rebar stakes, and then I pound those in the ground, and then I just slip the PVC or the metal conduit right over top. So that works really well. In a raised bed, well, it depends on your raised bed. Sometimes your raised bed, it'll just kind of fit within the wood, and then it holds it kind of steady. But you can also buy C-clips. That you can then kind of hook on to, like that you can screw them into the wood of your bed, and they hold the hoops very secure. So if you've got 1/2 inch, you'd be buying 1/2 inch clips that you just would screw in. So I do that as well, and that keeps them upright, perfect position. They don't sag or at all. But in winter time, when I get a heavy snow load, I do add a wooden support like just down the middle of my tunnels, and I just use zip ties to secure it in place. And that prevents the sagging, like a PVC conduit hoop post might collapse under like 6 inches or a foot of snow. So that prevents that as well.
Great, thank you. Another question, we had a few people kind of wondering, I think trying to understand how much temperature modulation some of these methods produce, and sort of commenting like, don't the plants freeze? I wondered maybe, for example, that picture that you showed of Salanova with the snow, like, how cold was it, and what temperatures were they kind of surviving?
I'm such a Celsius person. I'm going to go to Fahrenheit. It was below freezing because I was freezing. It was probably like -6, which is probably like, I don't know, 24 maybe Fahrenheit. It was cold. So that's a big, broad question, and which of course I delve into in my books, but it's about growing varieties. Like, it's not just the crops that are cold tolerant, but certain varieties are more cold tolerant than others. So yes, I'm growing lettuce in winter, but I'm growing the ones that are most cold tolerant. So yes, I'm harvesting broccoli in December, January, but I'm growing something like Marathon, which is really cold tolerant, versus just a summer type broccoli or a spring broccoli. So first of all, it's pairing, so choosing and selecting the most cold hardy varieties. But then it depends on the materials of what you're building your mini hoop tunnels or your cold frames or your polytunnels from. For example, a cold frame with glass is going to offer a different, it's going to capture and hold energy differently than something made from twin wall or triple wall polycarbonate. So, there's a lot of differential there in terms of how much heat it holds. But essentially, if you've got a cold frame and it's facing towards the south, even in a very cold day, if it's freezing, I do keep thermometers in my cold frames, and I have them hooked up to my phone so I can kind of monitor it. You don't have to. I never used to, but I do it now because it's kind of fun and I like to keep track of that data. But if say it's below freezing outside, but it's sunny out, my cold frame, it might be 60 in there. And in which case, if it pops above freezing, I might go up and like vent it because it's getting quite warm in there. Now, if it's minus, or say 26 or 25, excuse me, and it's cloudy outside, or it's raining, or it's snowing, then obviously it's not going to get to 60. It's not going to get as warm because that's dependent on the weather as well. But generally speaking, most of the crops in my winter cold frames, sometimes they freeze in there, but they never deep freeze, and they're cold hardy varieties. And during the day, generally, the temperatures rise up above freezing, and that's when I would harvest, when the crops are defrosted. I mean, I go into this in a lot of detail in the books, but there's just so many elements that come into play, to give exact numbers on the different materials and stuff is difficult to do right now.
No, I think that's excellent. Thank you. I think that answers the questions. And while we're on the topic, I did also see some questions just related to maybe like recommendations for ventilation. How much ventilation do you need to provide, and how much do you need to think about that?
I guess it depends if it's like a polytunnel or greenhouse, or if it's like a cold frame or mini hoop tunnel. Like for a mini hoop tunnel, say it's the temperature's just above freezing, but it's sunny out. Obviously, it's going to heat up under there really quickly. It can raise up by 20 or 30 degrees, the temperature underneath that cover versus the outside temperature. So oftentimes I'll go up and I'll just clip up the end so that air can flow through. Again, it depends on the time of year and what I'm growing under there. I would be treating something like spinach differently than I would peppers, where peppers aren't that cold hardy. So it does depend on the crop as well in terms of how much I vent. But if I'm going to, if the temperature is above freezing, and say I'm going to vent if I can, and if it's a sunny day, because the temperature will heat up really quickly under those covers. If I'm going out for the whole day and I know it's going to be mild outside, I'll probably pop the cold frame top open completely, or lift up the ends completely of my mini hoop tunnels, or I will open the door of my polytunnel or roll up the sides a little bit. And that's one of the reasons I went with a polytunnel. For me, it was about cost, but also the fact that I can roll up the sides. It makes it so easy to vent a structure. Having a glass greenhouse, for example, is harder to vent. Often you have to install a fan to get that air moving and bring the temperature down, which uses electricity, of course, and it's really loud sometimes. So I'm trying not to rely on, using electricity, using energy for my structures. I would rather just be able to roll up the sides, open the windows, open the door, and let the air flow through to vent. But even venting, again, I always say err on the side of venting, because you want your crops growing slightly colder for fall and winter. In spring, that's not as critical, trying to make your crops more hardy. You just want to protect them if the temperatures are really cold. But I do definitely vent often just to make sure they have good airflow. And if you keep them closed all the time, not only does, it stay too warm for the crops to grow well, but you could promote disease as well, and fungal problems, bacteria problems in there if air isn't flowing. So there's a lot of reasons to vent. Again, I have a whole chapter on that in my books, but that's sort of like the quick and dirty overview.
That's great. Thank you. Okay. A lot of other people wanted to know about how you prevent rodent problems under cover. And a few people also asked about aphids. Those were the two pests that really came up in the questions.
Yeah, aphids are magical. They come out of nowhere. My cousin asked me yesterday how she sees aphids in a plant in her condo. She's like, I'm like 8 stories up. Where do they come from? I'm like, oh, they are magic. They come from anywhere. Yeah, I don't have a big problem with aphids in my garden. I mean, they're here and there, but that's okay because they're food for ladybugs and lacewings. So I don't mind that so much. They're generally not a big problem. Obviously in winter, they're not a problem at all because it's too cold for them. In the shoulder seasons of spring and fall, sometimes I'll see them a bit on my lettuce, for example. So that's part of the monitoring process. If I see aphids during the shoulder season, maybe I'll just knock them off the plant with a little bit of water. You could use a soapy spray if you want as well. They're not a huge problem for me. If you grow things really like in warmer conditions, if you don't try to vent often and try to grow them a little colder, for example, in fall, and you get a lot of that fresh green growth. That's what aphids love. So for me, that's another reason to avoid that fresh green growth. It's going to get damaged when the temperatures drop in late autumn, but you're also going to encourage problems like aphids. So venting can actually help reduce the occurrence of aphids. Also, your soil, high nitrogen fertilizers also, again, push out lush green growth, which can be very enticing to aphids. So I try not to rely too much on fertilizers like that. And I never use like chemical-based fertilizers because A, it's not good for my soil, but B, it often is like, like drugs for your plants and pushing out all this fresh green growth. It's more susceptible to pests. And what was the other question?
Rodents.
What was the other pest question? Oh, thank you. Yeah, rodents. I have had a mouse in my greenhouse before the polytunnel. So probably 2 years ago, I did have a mouse in there that was a little tenacious. And it took me a while to catch it, and I had to trap it in the end and then relocate it. But of course, I mean, why wouldn't I want to be in there? It's such a nice environment compared to being outside in the winter. So I don't really blame it, but I obviously don't want to have rodent problems in my structures. I haven't had problems in my cold frames in all of these decades. I did once, wondering if I would. I did put hardware cloth on the bottom, so I know that's something a lot of people do. It's like a very close, metallic type material you can put on the bottom of your cold frames before you put them on top of the soil or sink them down into the soil, and that'll help prevent rodents from like crawling up and chewing through it. Chicken wire obviously lets them through. The holes are too big. Plus, I've seen them chew through it. A little scary. So hardware cloth I find works pretty well that way. So that's what I would recommend. Don't think that landscape fabric or anything like that is going to stop them. It won't. So if you think you have a problem, if you have a lot of rodents in your garden now, or if you're worried about it, I would use hardware cloth in the bottom of your, you could even do it in the bottom of your raised beds if you're building raised beds to top with mini hoop tunnels, but definitely on the bottoms of cold frames.
Yep. Great. Thank you. We had a couple questions. Are you heating your polytunnel at all at any parts of the season?
No, never. I mean, I even am able to, I'm in zone 5. I should have said that at the beginning. 5B. I even overwinter artichokes in there, which are, zone 7, 7B, sometimes 8 plant globe artichokes. So, I overwinter them in one end of the polytunnel underneath a nice, like 2-foot layer of straw in there. And they've overwintered for me for 4 years. So it's amazing to have artichokes picking from the garden in like early May, huge artichokes. But yeah, I do not heat it at all. Never have I put heat in there. And if I was going to do something to try to heat it, maybe I would, line the middle pathway with stones to act as a heat sink, or I would put in some barrels of water along the back to act as a heat sink, or you could even have some compost in there to act as a heat sink to generate, or not as a heat sink, but to generate, warmer temperatures as the pile decomposes. Or I know people that have kept things like rabbit cages in their, where they keep rabbits inside a greenhouse or a polytunnel to generate heat as well. Now, I don't know how much heat they generate, but I would recommend a heat sink if you wanted to do something like that. But you can also buy small greenhouse heaters. Again, my goal is to keep things as inexpensive as possible so other people can do what I do if they want to. And I don't want to use any more energy. I know it would be amazing to have a greenhouse that was slightly warmer, and I could do so much more with it. I'd love to overwinter figs in my greenhouse, for example. But again, I don't need to use the energy. I'm doing just fine in terms of what I harvest, and we eat seasonally. And, I think that's one of the biggest pleasures of having a garden. So yeah, no heat.
Great. Thank you. We had a question on how long do the row covers last? I know you answered that for shade cloth and the poly. So I think maybe that question was sort of related to the other coverings that you talked about.
Yeah. Well, it depends on the weight of the row cover. Obviously, the heaviest weight ones last longer because they're thicker and heavier. But my lightweight and medium weight row covers probably last for at least 5 to 7 years. Now, that depends how you use them, because there's different ways to secure row covers. You can buy garden staples, like the little U-shaped metal staples. You stick them through a row cover to hold it securely in place. Listen, that works great, but it's going to put holes and tears in your row cover. So if you do that, they're going to last 2 to 3 years maximum before they tear. Maybe even not even that long if you have hard winter winds that kind of then vibrate the covers and cause them to tear even more. So, then they're like a 1, maybe 2 season cover. So it depends how you secure them. If you're using snap clamps, again, 5 to 7 years, I would say, with good care. If they get really dirty, I hang them on a clothesline and I hose them off, let them dry again. I try to take care of them. But yeah, they can last quite a while with decent care. You can put
Great.
them in your washing machine, but I don't want to get my washing machine that dirty, so I don't.
Okay, that was another question is, do you wash them and then maybe specifically, do you sanitize them to try to keep down spread of any diseases?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I don't. I do. I mean, I'll hose them off, as I said, but I don't. I don't sanitize them. I don't think I've ever needed to. I've never noticed them spreading disease per se of any type. I mean, they are. They do let water and air pass through, so yeah, I haven't had a need to sanitize them at all. So yeah, no.
Okay, great. And I know you've recommended the snap clamps. There were a couple questions just, for ease of taking the covers on and off for harvesting, winter harvest, especially.
Yep.
Any other additional recommendations or thoughts there?
Yeah, and I mean, in growing undercover, I talk about this, but because I get so much wind in winter, so from my cold frames, I do also like I do secure the plastic to the sides of my frames in winter, and again, I show photos of how I do that in the book and stuff. But yeah, for snap clamps, they snap on and off really easy, even with my mittened hands. So I just pop them off the ends. And then I just kind of lift up the cover and I'll harvest what I want from a winter cold frame. The one that I showed with the Salanova and me lifting up the cover, I was just doing that from the side because I had harvested from it the day before and I didn't completely close it, the cover, so it was still not like secured on the side, so it was easy to lift. But generally, I'm just lifting from either end, and with 8-foot beds, it's pretty easy to reach, into the bed, the whole bed from either end. So that's all I generally do. And then I close them back up again. I snap the things back on, the little snap clamps. And then often I'll have like rocks or something on the bottom or a weight just to hold the bottom of the poly down from flapping. And that works well.
That's great. Thank you. We had a few questions on irrigation. I know you did cover that in your presentation. And I think maybe just some questions of how much irrigation do you find you have to do during the winter months? And what you find is the most efficient way to do that.
Yeah. So during the winter months, I generally, and this is changing with the climate emergency. I mean, everything is different. I used to mulch my plants in mid-November, or even sometimes early November, the carrots and such for the winter. Now I'm doing it in December. I mean, things have changed a lot. I used to do my last watering in mid to late November. And that was it for pretty much the whole garden. But now I'm doing it, into December, into mid-December. So for the cold frames, for mini hoop tunnels, I generally don't water in the winter at all. Come like February, for example, if we do it often now, warmer stretches in February. So if we have a warmer stretch, maybe I'll open them up and let the rain fall in the cold frames or the mini hoop tunnels. I'll take the covers off if we have early spring weather that's really warm, and I'll let Mother Nature irrigate. The polytunnel, I do start watering probably by late February, just spot watering here or there, as I start to clean up and replant again. So that will start getting watered then. But I mean, December and January for the most of winter, I'm not watering really at all because the plants aren't transpiring as much in the winter time. They're not putting on a lot of active growth. And especially in a cold frame, like it's holding in a lot of the moisture. It's not just going off into the air to evaporate. So it's sort of like a closed system. So again, not a lot of moisture is escaping. So I don't have to water that much. The plants aren't transpiring at a rate that they would during the spring, summer, fall. And irrigation isn't necessarily, as something that I have to do all the time. You could also mulch, in a cold frame, often I'll have carrots in there and maybe I'll put a bit of straw in there. Or if I have greens, I might mulch between some rows or beets or something with some straw. And that further holds soil moisture as well in a structure. So again, that reduces the need to water even more. Gardeners in more southern areas, of course, like in Midwest states or, in like Kentucky, Tennessee, places like that, they would probably still have to water a bit here and there in the wintertime. But gardeners in cold climates will be watering less.
Great, thank you. I think we'll make this our last question. There are a couple questions on maintaining soil health in the polytunnel specifically. Do you try to rotate crops within that small space, and do you amend the soil in any, I guess, maybe additional ways than what you discussed for all of your beds with compost and that sort of thing?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that's something a lot of greenhouse gardeners struggle with because most of us just want to grow the same crops in there every year. The tomatoes, the peppers, the eggplants. the cucumbers, melons, things like that. And a lot of those guys, the eggplants, the tomatoes, the peppers, they're in the same family. So you really do need to crop rotate. Do I do it as well as I should in the polytunnel? Admittedly, no, I don't do it quite as well as I should. And that's on me. But what I do, there we go. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't know why it
You're
muted
good.
me for a minute. There we go. Yes, I do amend my soil, of course, in the greenhouse. I was just doing that yesterday as I was clearing out some areas in the greenhouse. So yeah, between successive crops, I'm amending with about 1 inch of compost or aged manure. I'm using slow release organic fertilizers. I test my soil, well, probably every year in the polytunnel, just to see what the organic matter is at, to test nutrient levels, because that area is cropped so intensively. Or it's sheltered, obviously, as well from rain and stuff. I just want to make sure it stays really healthy. And when I deep water to try to get the water all the way down as deeply as I can. So those are some things I do to maintain the soil. And I do try to crop rotate in terms of I grow cucumbers and I grow tomatoes, but it's more of a 2-year crop rotation, unfortunately. In the greenhouse, it's not the 4-year I maintain in my garden, just because, again, it's such a limited space, and I generally want to grow the same crops in there from year to year. But I also have those center fabric bags where I grow tomatoes, every year, my indeterminate tomatoes like Sun Gold and things like that. So those bags do get sterilized every year. And they get totally new growing medium every year. So I don't have to worry about crop rotation for those. So that is definitely helpful, growing in containers. So you could maintain a 3-year crop rotation in a greenhouse by adding containers into the equation. So there's lots of ways to kind of get around that a little bit. But yes, soil health is very important in a closed structure.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I think that wraps up our Q&A session. Thank you so much for answering so many questions, and thank you to everyone for submitting so many questions. That was great.
Thank you, Liv, and thank you, Nikki, for this presentation. There's just so much information jam-packed in it. I think, judging by the chat questions and responses, folks found it quite interesting and engaging. And I just want to say to everybody that a recording of this presentation will be available on Monday, along with a link to our winter growing and season extension library, which is packed with articles, charts, how-to videos. You'll want to go to johnnyseeds.com/webinars. You'll also find a link to savvygardening.com, where you'll find more about Nikki, her books, her online courses, and a whole lot more. And then finally, special thanks to all of you who joined us today. We hope you enjoyed learning more about the topics we covered and that you are ready to try some of these new methods for successfully extending your growing season. Until next time, best wishes from the employee owners at Johnny's, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for tonight. Thank you, Johnny's.